where software quality lives, breathes, and keeps evolving.
Welcome to the Quality Beat, the podcast where we explore ideas shaping the future of software quality. Today, we're talking about a challenge many QA teams face, and that is how to communicate testing results in a way that actually helps leadership make release decisions. Too often, QA reports are packed with test counts, pass rates, and defect lists, but still leave managers asking the same question. So, can we release? Our guest today is Chris Mastnak, who leads Nagarro's global adaptive quality management practice. And Chris has spent years helping organizations turn testing insights into something far more powerful and stories that give leadership confidence to ship. He's also running a workshop at Eurostar this year called Make Management Listen, QA Stories That Build Confidence. And today we're going to unpack some of the thinking behind that approach, especially how QA teams can move from raw metrics to narratives that actually support decisions. Chris, welcome back to the Quality Beat.
Thanks for having me back, Gurpreet.
It's great to have you. And as always, before we get started and dive into the topic, let's do a quick fire warm-up round. So you ready?
I'm ready.
Great. Okay. First one then. If your QA strategy were a cocktail, what would you call it?
I think it's too early to ask that question, but I think I would call it the designated driver because we need to keep a clear head at QA and we need to make sure the release gets home safely.
I love that title. Sums it up well. Okay, next one then. If your last bug could talk, what would its catchphrase be?
I would go maybe with catch me if you can, or I worked fine on local. This is what most bugs are saying lately.
Catch me if you can. I like it. But yeah, I worked fine on local is also very representative of what you deal with on a day-to-day. Next one then. QA as a movie genre, would you say it falls within comedy, thriller, or horror?
I think it's a workplace comedy. You have a lot of very, very smart people, and
Yep.
they're all pretending to be surprised when things are not working close to release, when they could have just listened to QA 3 sprints ago.
That's how I know you're an expert in the topic. I would have said horror.
No, I cannot live in a horror movie for so many years.
Yeah. Final one then. Which emoji best sums up your testing style?
I think I'm way too Xennial to still, keep up with all the new emojis. But on Slack, there's this fire truck. And I really like this fire truck. I feel this is where QA often comes in.
Putting out fires everywhere, right?
Exactly.
Very nice. Okay, and now let's get stuck into this topic. So, Chris, you've probably seen hundreds of QA reports over your career. Can you remember a moment where a QA report completely failed to give leadership the confidence they needed to release and expand on what actually went wrong there?
Yeah, I mean, there is one I remembered quite clearly from an e-commerce context, and the paper looked good. The full report, lots of tests, lots of green, very good pass percentage, not so many prior one defects. The whole thing was looking good. And if you think, I look at it quickly, yeah, looks okay. We're in good shape. But in reality, one of those bugs, the few ones that were there, was that the checkout API was struggling under load. And that's the one thing that matters, So we had the strange situation where we have a report that looks, we are all green or mostly green. But in the system, there's one thing that can fail the whole thing in the one place where the business makes money.
Yeah.
And I think, that's the key point for me. Nothing is wrong with showing the testing effort. The team had worked really hard. The problem was that the report was describing what they did, their activity, but not what they covered. Not did we test everything? Is everything still working? Can the customer still buy when the traffic goes up? And this is the question, that matters usually for leadership. So here the report looked very green, but didn't help us at all.
So it's almost like anticipating what other potential things could go wrong, and it kind of sounds a bit like chaos engineering to me.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously many QA teams, like you've mentioned, right, they still present these detailed dashboards and reports which are full of these testing metrics. From the perspective of the executives who are looking at these reports, what are they actually trying to understand?
I mean, most executives are not sitting there thinking, oh, that's interesting. They've executed 2,400 test cases across 5 cycles. They would like to know, can we release? How bad can it get? What happens if we ship now? And those are also very human questions like, are customers getting stuck? Are support teams going to be flooded? Or are we going to lose revenue in a place where we cannot recover? Or is there going to be a very uncomfortable call with the board tomorrow morning? So those are the questions that usually people in leadership functions care about, and not so much about how many test cases have been executed. Of course, that always looks impressive if you can talk about thousands, but it's not so reassuring if you don't know what they actually test. And we are giving, as a tester, often a lot of our internal data, a lot of our internal workings without any translations, and leadership has to translate that themselves. And many of them won't. They don't have the time for it. They'll just ask, can we release or not? And this is something that you should be telling them from the beginning, and not how many tests you tested.
Absolutely. It's about knowing your audience, and like you said, with the executives, they're thinking about all of the what if scenarios,
Yeah.
and not so interested in terms of what's been tested. So if you can kind of reassure them from that perspective, I guess that would make them feel a bit more comfortable. So rewinding a bit then, right? What are the typical reactions you see from executives when they are handed a long list of test counts and defect logs?
I mean, to be honest, most of them just scan it and then see, how can I translate that, or who can help me translate that? And we have to understand that people that are not in testing or QA, they don't want to engage with defect taxonomy or what's a priority 1, what's a priority 3, what's the different. They don't usually study the testing result charts in detail. They just want somebody to tell them what it means. And I think, often QA teams, and maybe that was also in my past, I quietly hope that showing the volume of my work with itself show what we did, and whatever management wants to know, they can read out of it themselves. If the document is big enough, detailed enough or technical enough, then maybe that's proving that we are serious, and someone, will just take the information that they need out of that. But this is not the same as helping a decision. So I've seen so many reports that were very thorough, but still absolutely unhelpful. And they were built basically a bit like a legal protection. Everything is in there. Nobody can say we didn't report it. But that's not what leadership is looking for. Leadership support is showing them, there is no ambiguity. There is the risk in here. And this is something we provide to you, and not look for it yourself in our reports.
Absolutely. And I think that goes further into what we just discussed as well, because you're looking for somebody to provide you an analysis or interpretation of that report, as opposed to those test case tallies and pass fail rates. That basically means nothing to somebody who doesn't actually work in that space. And so obviously what they're being provided at the moment, it sounds like it often fails to answer the question that leaders really care about, which is, can we safely release this?
hmm And this is something that all those generic metrics don't really tell you. They tell you what happened inside the testing team or inside the functions that are do testing in the organization,
Mm.
but they don't automatically tell you what it means in the real world. So a pass rate sounds good, but it really depends on what passed, what business function, the critical pass, the checkout, did those all pass, or did just the low risk functionality pass and we missed one unstable payment path? And that would
Mm.
have been super important. If the number is like 99.7, that looks impressive, but that
Yeah.
0.3% that have not passed could be where the business really is getting hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, that those metrics are useless. I think they're very helpful and mostly internally helpful for the QA team or test managers,
Mm.
but they are showing an incomplete pictures. They need to be interpreted. They need context. They need somebody to say, hey, this is what we covered. This is what we didn't cover. This is maybe a bit shaky here. And this is what it means if we get real users on the system tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. I guess it would allow them to make more educated, informed decisions.
Yeah.
Why do you think the metrics feel overwhelming or unhelpful to non-QA leaders?
I think the metrics are usually designed, from the inside out. They are designed from QA by the same way they organize their work and
Mm-hmm.
not, focused on how to make decisions. I think if, a non-QA leader doesn't naturally think in defect categories and execution cycles and regression sizes. They
Mm.
think, what's my customer pain? What's my business interruption? What's my operational fallout? How much cost do I have per week of delay? So if I hand them a dashboard full of all those technical QA labels, they're, you know, they need someone to translate that. And also,
Mm.
there is also so much visual noise in those reports often. There's like hundreds of bugs reported, but they might be tiny cosmetic bugs.
Mm.
But you cannot see, oh, wait, there is this one broken order flow, and that's super, super, super critical. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe we should focus more on that one and not reporting also all the cosmetic noise. And I think, we often let the reader guess what part of the pile is on fire.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a great way to support them. I think we need to show them better, what those numbers reflect.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so we've looked at it from the let's say non-QA leaders perspective or the executives perspective, and now just flipping the focus onto the actual testers. What assumptions do testers make about those numbers that leaders simply don't share?
Oh, I think it's not just about leaders, but I think, we assume often that everyone takes the same assumptions about what our labels mean.
Mm-hmm.
When we are talking severity 1, severity 2, or critical defect or blocker or whatever, we assume that this is super clear to everyone.
Yeah.
But people that are not in QA have often a different thinking. They can say critical to whom? Blocking what? Is it critical for revenue? Is it critical for trust? Is it critical for our support or operations team? So we need to make sure that everyone is on the same page with what labels we're using to classify defects, for example, or findings.
Mm-hmm.
And the other assumption that a lot of QAs have is that, and this is maybe not a nice thing to hear, but that providing the information about the effort means proving control. We
Mm-hmm.
worked hard, we executed a lot, we found things, so therefore this should feel reassuring. But it's not for leadership, it's not about the effort the testers made, it's about reducing the risk of issues during rollout or during production thing. And that's a very different thing than showing how much we worked as QAs.
Absolutely. And so it's going back to the fundamentals again. Just to go into that a bit more, then, uh, how do you go about uncovering what a QA director or an engineering manager really needs in order to actually decide on a release?
Mm. I usually try to start with the decision they have to make, and I try to ask them, what would make you stop this release? What kind of failure is unacceptable for you?
Mm.
And what might be okay under certain conditions. So basically, what can be fixed later and what would damage our trust or our business immediately? And that's the red line that we cannot ship. And if you have those answers, then you can work backwards. Maybe a QA director is caring a bit more about whether the coverage is growing or falling, or the same, bugs come reappearing. And then
Mm-hmm.
engineering manager might be more looking towards what are my rollback options? What is monitoring readiness? Can we support the load with our systems?
Right.
So I think to sum it up, it's basically we try to discover the one thing they would regret missing, and QA is there to not miss things, although we often do.
Yeah. Okay. And so going into that then, right? You're trying to discover the thing that they would regret missing. Now, what questions should a QA lead ask a product manager, for example, to discover what their top release concerns
Mm.
are?
Yeah, I think with the product managers, we are often very much in the business flows, and we have to look with them at customer behavior. We have to say, and the product managers, they know this best, which customer journey matters the most in the first day or in the first week. Where do we have a very fragile funnel? Where do we have a lot of customers give up or call support or just not come back?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's, really on the business flow side. On the other hand, I think timing is also very important, especially if you work in e-commerce. There's
Yeah.
often campaigns, there's market deadlines, there's a big holiday coming up, or there's maybe a quarter end revenue call coming up. So maybe, something that's a risk at one point of time might not be a risk at another point of time. This is
Mm-hmm.
something I try to get from my product managers. And what they don't like so much, but I try to force it on them, is asking really like trade-off questions like, would you rather hold the release for 2 days, or would you
Mm-hmm.
rather have the conversion rate drop for like say 10% in the first 48 hours? And then, if you ask like that, maybe people are a bit struggling to answer, but you get into a discussion what really matters for them to release.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good way of getting down to what's important as well, putting things into perspective like that and quantifying it in a way where it helps them to really see the importance. Um, I'm curious, can you give an example of two stakeholders where the priorities differed and how you tailored your data to each one?
Sure. I mean, let's take the product manager you mentioned earlier and maybe a CTO. And I think they both care, but they care differently about the system and about the outcomes. I think, the CTO is maybe caring a bit more about unstable response times throughout UI, API. And for them, you have to usually frame things like a platform resilience issue, like scalability, architecture stress, downstream problems like operational costs, operations cost. And this is the one thing that they would like to have contained.
Mm-hmm.
And for the product manager, it's much less on the technical side. Usually it's much more about the customer journey. It's like, look, the delay is landing in checkout or in account creation. This is a point where users are already impatient. Nobody wants to set up an account again. People hate it so much. And that means they abandon their basket, they get frustrated, or they support contact and maybe hit a bit the trust. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
same problem, and we have the same evidence from testing, but the decision lens is a bit different. And I think if you give both people the same abstract dashboard, neither of them will get what they want to have out of it.
Mm-hmm. They're approaching it from their own areas of expertise and interest, let's say. Okay, I spotted in this year's Eurostar conference program then that you're running a workshop on moving from test counts to a coverage plus confidence narrative. Walk me through, what does that actually look like?
I mean, the basic idea, it's very simple. Like coverage tells you what we tested, and
Hmm.
confidence tells you how much we trust our findings, how much uncertainty and risk still is there. So instead of saying like we ran this many tests and most of them passed, we try to say something more useful. So we
Hmm.
try to say we covered the buying flow or the refunds flow or the login recovery. And we can say, and confidence is very high in the normal pass, but a bit lower in peak load checkout because we could not run that many performance or load tests.
Hmm.
We could also say it still limited our confidence when we look at third-party retry handling or external payment providers because their systems were not available in the test window. Something like that, just
Hmm.
to tell people this is covered, confidence is high or confidence is low in our results in there. And that's much better than showing the volume of test activity, even though we love to show the volume of test activity.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, right? If you just give them that report, it's almost like they don't know where it lacks. Whereas if you have that constructive conversation, like you just mentioned, they're aware of it and they know exactly what to look out for
Mhm.
whilst that release is happening. Okay. And what's your framework then for turning the rows of metrics into a concise release narrative?
I try to keep it very simple. I barely like to call it a framework because it feels so simple to me, but I focus on three things: context, insight, and recommendation.
Hmm.
So context is what are we changing? Why does it matter? That's the easy part usually.
Yeah.
Insight is what did testing actually reveal? And does that change the risk picture? And the
Hmm.
recommendation is what should we do now? And I think that's where a lot of reports break. They often contain facts, but they don't land the point. Or, they provide the insight, but they don't give any recommendation, any action that should follow. And then it becomes, in a group discussion, and that's all something we want to avoid. We don't want to sit for hours in the same calls. So a good release narrative saves people that work. It says, hey, here's the change, here's the risk, and this is the sensible next step. And then we move along.
Absolutely. You make it seem so straightforward and I can I can picture why that recommendation might be missing. So I'm thinking if a QA team has dozens of metrics available, uh, how would they decide which of those metrics make the final cut and which get left behind?
Mm. I'm I'm fairly aggressive about that final cut, and I learned that from one of my customers. And whenever I presented him with a QA report, he looked at me and said, "So what?"
Hmm.
Um, and now I call it the so what test. So if a metric doesn't help the person that I'm reporting to make or improve a decision or inform a decision, it does not belong in that reporting layer. It doesn't mean that the metric doesn't have values at some other place. Maybe the team still needs it for trend analysis or engineering follow-up. But not every useful internal metric needs to be brought into a release decision or a QA report.
Hmm.
So I usually like more showing metrics or signals that show movement or concentration of risk, like a trend getting worse, having more and more open bugs, having more and more flaky areas in a critical path, or sudden increases in failures after certain integration, where you say, hey, since we did that change, it's just not stable anymore. And I think that looks it's much more important than the nice looking pie chart telling me that 98% of my tests were fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And related to that, then, when you use financial metrics like the cost of poor quality, how do you get development to then actually agree on those numbers?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And to be honest, you don't need to chase perfect precision there. It's like you don't want to kill a discussion before it begins. I usually start with a transparent estimate and say, this is where my numbers come from, make the assumptions visible. And, if you have someone saying, oh, I don't agree with those numbers, then I can say, okay, what's a better number? Let's use that. And to be honest, most of the time, the actual number doesn't matter so much. It just is important to put some amounts to bugs or to issues that you can compare the impact or say, yes, this is really important or not. And it's much more important to get this alignment that, yes, there is an impact than saying, hey, this impact is 20K or is 25K. The figure doesn't have to be so precise.
Yeah, you need that alignment instead. And so how do you weave then a clear recommendation into your QA data story so that management can act on it? You mentioned the framework earlier, but I'm interested in hearing more about the recommendation part.
Yeah, that's the hard part. And
Yeah.
we often shy away from that a bit because, then someone could hold me accountable if we take the wrong decision and we made the wrong recommendation. But, we need to get away from those vague caution labels. So instead saying we should be careful, I like to say, hey, keep the gate closed until this payment retry issue is fixed and rerun under realistic load. That's a very specific thing. I'm not saying, never release, but I'm just saying hold release until you fix this one thing. Or I say release it, release this part or do an AP test, release it only to 1,000 users before we go out to the full user base. And I think it also helps to include the consequence, not to be, dramatic, but to make the trade-off visible. You can say delay by 48 hours and reduce the risk of the failed transaction, or ship now and accept that we'll have maybe some revenue leakage or need some manual work in the operations team to clean up all the data. And sometimes, that's a choice people can make. And they say, well, actually, we are fine with cleaning up the data manually. We just want to roll out before the holiday. And I get that because that's how they make their money.
Absolutely. And I think they value that honesty and transparency, which impacts the entire QA storytelling. And it sounds like it works very well. How does it change the release conversation with leadership then, when you approach it from that angle?
I think it changes the tone quite a lot. It's a bit less defending the testing process and our findings. It's more about working together to find a level of risk that everyone can accept. We can say, are we okay releasing with this limitation? Because the rollback is very easy. So we roll out at 2 a.m. We have very few users online at this point. Rollout will be done in an hour or two. So yeah, let's just, go out with this defect and see if it really affects only a tiny population. Do we have a clear workaround? And I think that's a much better conversation than saying, have you tested this and have you tested this and have you tested this?
Yeah.
And often, what I'm trying to do is make QA look less dramatic and not more. Usually everyone is like red, you cannot release, and then it's getting released anywhere and it's basically fine.
Yeah.
And we in QA we always want everything to be perfect and green, and that's something we have to go away a bit. We have to look more into what is good enough and what is leadership willing to release. And sometimes, we need to help them with our results. But we need to build their trust for that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And then in your experience, what's one storytelling technique that builds that leadership trust?
I think, one part is what I already mentioned, is translating those technical findings into business reality. And without overselling, of course, I am never saying I'm 100% sure. And I'm also not saying, hey, we saw latency degradation in service X. I say, hey, this slowdown is hitting checkout at the point where most customers are most likely to abandon. So if we have more volume tonight, we expect failed payments. And that kind of translation shows that QA doesn't care just about testing, but about the business. And we all need to get more on that side. And the second part is we have to be honest about what we don't know. If the coverage is only partial, I say that. If the evidence is noisy, I also say that. Usually the leaders, trust you more if you are clear on uncertainty than trying to give some kind of synthetic confidence that everyone can see through that it's not real.
So it's about providing that holistic view to show that you've considered everything. Now, on the flip side of that, right? So you've just mentioned about how you want to look at that side of it. But if you had flaky tests, right? How do you handle the whole narrative that's based on trust when you're coming at it from that angle?
Yeah, that's really difficult too. I mean, flaky tests damage the credibility of the whole QA organization. If I have tests going red, green, and nobody explains why, then everyone will slowly start discounting what the testers are reporting. And that's a bit dangerous because once the trust drops, then the real warnings get ignored. So I think that's a real house cleaning or housekeeping issue test managers need to do all the time, constantly, to not let flaky tests contaminate the main stories. We have to quarantine, fix them, remove them from the release report until they are trustworthy. And we should do that constantly and not just when we are getting a report.
Right. And then just on to my next question, Chris. For teams just starting to shift from raw metrics to storytelling, what is the first change they should make?
I'd probably say remove that pass rate chart from the front page of the report or from the top left corner of the dashboard. This is evil because it's a fast route to a false sense of safety, and put a simple statement there about critical path coverage and current confidence. What did we test that truly matters? This is the first thing I would like to do whenever I come into a project and I see reporting is not going well.
Really tell that story, right? And are there any tools or templates that you would recommend for structuring QA reports as a story rather than that whole spreadsheet or that providing that false sense of safety?
I'm not really against tools or templates, but I think context, insight, and recommendation is something that works everywhere, in a slide, in a status email, in a report, or even in a speaking note before a meeting. So I think, you don't need tools for that. You don't need a beautiful dashboard. You can just provide that information. It will help more than everything else. But one thing I really like is using AI for pressure testing the story. So I ask my AI of choice in that week what a skeptical CTO would challenge, or where evidence sounds weak, or which business consequence is missing. I think this is very useful because it helps sharpen the narrative before you go into a real room. And it also keeps you down to earth when you drift into, using labels like priority 1 and priority 2 and severity that might not be the same for everyone.
That's a really good use case for AI, to be honest. I don't think I've heard of that being used before. So yeah,
Test
I might
managers
try
should use
that.
it more, much more.
Great. And finally then, Chris, if listeners remember only one thing when preparing their next QA report, what should it be?
I think is answer the so what before anyone else has to ask for it. Before you send the report, look at it and think, would that person ask so what? Or have you already written that into the report or made it clear or drawn it out on a chart?
Totally agree. Chris, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think many QA teams will recognize the challenge of producing detailed reports that still don't answer the one question that leadership really cares about, which is whether they can release with confidence.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it today.
It's been a pleasure to have you. And for listeners who want to explore this topic further, Chris will also be running a hands-on workshop at Eurostar called Make Management Listen, QA stories that build confidence in June 2026. Thanks for tuning into the Quality Beat. We'll see you in the next episode.